Welcome to a Wonder Junkie podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Anderson.
Nobody knows what's going on. Nobody knows. Nobody has the faintest idea. The best guesses are lies. You may be sure of it.
Sheldon, thank you so much for joining me this morning.
My pleasure, Ryan.
It's afternoon now for you, actually. But yeah, it's nice that you and I can chat from across the world. I do love that about technology. So I found your work, I think, in 2020 through Lex Friedman, and I really love his podcast, have for a long time. And it sent me down the avenue of reading Ernest Becker's The Denial of Death, which became one of my favorite books, as it is yours. And that book is highlighted and tabbed, and I've just really loved it. And I've loved the way he speaks about death being the core. And I've loved your book, so I'd love to talk about it. I'd love to explore consciousness with you today and share your ideas with as many people as we can.
Yes, certainly. Let's do it.
Cool. Yeah, so I did discover from Ernest Becker and your work that death really is the essence of what makes human beings unique, whether it be art or technology or innovation or neurosis or war and religion. It just seems like it really is at the core. And it's made me become much more appreciative of death as what gives life meaning as well. And so at work, at the fire department, I see a lot of death. I see it probably more than the average person. And so that's part of what got me more interested in building a relationship to it that made more sense. And I meditate on it a lot, like the Stoics. And I always tell the guys at work, and they laugh, but I say, we're going to be dead soon. And it's not in a bad way. It's in a realistic way. And so,
Right.
yeah, I just thought we could share some of your ideas because you really have helped me stumble into this path a little bit deeper, and I'm going to keep going. So,
Good.
how did you get involved in it? I actually don't know the origin story of how you
Yeah.
became so obsessed with the subject yourself.
No, thank you, Ryan. It's actually like a lot of things by chance. I came to Skidmore College, where I now teach, in 1980. Trained as an experimental social psychologist with my main work having to do with designing experiments to determine the efficacy of different ways to manage stress. And I thought that was exciting and important work. But I also was asked to teach a class in personality theory at Skidmore that I knew little about. And I was in the library looking for some books by Freud, thinking that would be a good place to start. And then I literally accidentally stumbled on some books by Ernest Becker, who was a recently deceased at the time cultural anthropologist. And there were two books that caught my eye. One was called The Birth and Death of Meaning, and I pulled that off the shelf. And in the first paragraph, he said, I want to understand why people do what they do when they do it. And I was like, wow, me too. Very straightforward, very eager to integrate ideas from all various disciplines. And I found it exciting and uplifting. A little bit less so was the book right next door, The Denial of Death, where Becker in the first paragraph said that it was the uniquely human awareness of death and our disinclination to accept the reality of the human condition that motivated a substantial proportion of human activity, whether we were aware of it or not. Mostly we weren't. And Ryan, I stood there, and it was like getting kicked in the psychological groin. It reminded me that I've been disinclined to die since I was 8 years old, more or less, the day after my grandmother died. And I still remember it very vividly. She was very sick. My mom said the day before, say goodbye to grandma. She's going to die. She did indeed die thereafter. And, it was a mournful time. And I remember sitting there. I was a stamp collector. I'm looking at my old stamps, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, all the old presidents. And I'm like, wow, they're all dead. And then I was like, well, wait a minute. That means my mom is going to get old someday. And she too will die. And then I'm like, oh, where's dinner going to come from? And that was unnerving, but not so much as a minute or two later when I was like, wow, let's keep going. This implies at some vaguely unspecified moment that I too will be obliterated. And at 8 years old, I really do remember, this being a bit of an existential crisis that I buried under the psychological bushes for a couple of decades until looking at Ernest Becker directly and being reminded that at the very least what he was claiming was personally relevant for helping me understand my own life. And that then became the foundation for what my buddies and I did subsequently academically, and that's to try to design research that could test whether or not his rather bold claims that concerns about mortality influence just about everything, whether or not they appear to have empirical merit. So that's kind of how I got started on that road.
Cool. Yeah, I'd love to hear some of these experiments and how you guys structured them because that must be difficult. But I'm also curious if you had a belief system in place from a young age. Like, did you grow up religious or did you believe in God or what are your foundational belief systems?
Wow. All right. That's a fine question, Ryan. I grew up in what I would describe as a secular Jewish household. And these were folks who identified with Jewish identity, but were not particularly devoted in terms of being Orthodox by any means. And that gave me kind of an ambivalent stance towards organized religion. On the one hand, I have always found something deeply important about religiosity. And I'm a big fan of words, and the word religion comes from a Latin word that means to bind. And it actually, religion existed long before we had any conception of God. It is just our fundamental inclination as human beings to derive tremendous comfort and courage from being connected to each other. And in that sense, I still consider myself to be rather devout. And here I'll mangle some words because a lot of folks don't like conflating religiosity with spirituality. But what I found happening to myself, and this is not anything that I'm necessarily proud of, but as I got into my teenage years, I became disenchanted with religion as it seemed to me going not only to synagogues, but to my friends, mostly Christians of various assortments, Catholic, Presbyterian, Lutheran. I would go to church services, to services in synagogues, and it seemed profoundly hypocritical to me that the average individual might pretend to behave in accordance with religious edicts, but seemed rather morally impoverished otherwise. And that kind of drew me away from religion. And to make kind of a short story long, I have bounced back and forth over the years between a genuine affection for people who are devoutly religious, as well as a broader appreciation for folks that don't identify with religiosity per se, but admire and embrace the spiritual aspects. If I had to define myself today, I like the folks, the universalist folks who have kind of a religion derived from the transcendentalists, Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. This idea that there is something important and transcendental about being a human being, but it may not be reducible to one particular set of religious constructs. I mean, to put that, and I'll shut up in a moment, but what I find most troubling right now is a confusion and conflation with genuine religiosity and the way that it is now manifested in our cultural surroundings. Not to be aggravating or provocative, but Jesus would not identify as a Christian today in the country in which we currently reside. And I considered that to be an interesting challenge to folks at the moment and in the years to come.
I love that. And please feel free to go on your long rants. That's one of the things I like about you is that you're sort of poetic in that way with the subjects that you've been exploring. So it's
Well,
fun.
thank you, Ryan.
So yeah, don't ever apologize for that. But yeah, I've always sort of at this point in my life, I've really grown to realize that part of my relationship to death and to life and to the ideas of the mystical is to sort of surrender and let go and to be in awe and wonder and to be sort of blown away all the time by the fact that you're alive and awake and aware at all. It's such a mystery. And the mystery
Yes.
seems to be quite a beautiful thing to get in tune with. And the clinging and thinking, is actually where a lot of the suffering can really, the malaise comes from this. And that's what I've seen across culturally. It seems like when you start to explore it, you're like, where's the suffering coming from? Because that's what we
That's
want to
right.
mitigate. And it seems like practices like you mentioned in your email, which we can get into, breath work or mindfulness practices, help you to become connected to that inner space, that part of you that's like, oh, you know what? The whole thing is interconnected soup and it's
Yes.
magical. And so that becomes the beauty of the situation here because we are going to die, but we
Yeah.
don't know where we came from and we don't know where we're going. And that's just the truth.
It is
And
the
so,
truth.
anyway, yeah, the
But I
truth
like
is
how
way
you,
more important.
yes, but I really do like how you put it, and that's where our work is drifting these days. First of all, you've said some really amazing things, and to be a little bit repetitive, but it's like, first of all, this is here we are talking about death, but it's not about death, it's about life. So it was Socrates who said to philosophize is to learn how to die, but that was not in the service of expediting our demise. It was in the service of enhancing the quality of life. And I also am not an anthropologist, I'm not a religious scholar. And yet, the more I survey what's going on around us, there really does seem to be a convergence based on the practices that you describe in your breathwork site. And that is, it seems to me that all of these different great religious traditions, they all emphasize the need to accept our transient finitude in order to make the most out of life, both for ourselves and to diminish the pain that we cause to those around us. And what it really ultimately comes back to is the best way to manage existential anxieties is to embrace a way of life that recognizes our magical connection to
Mm.
all that is. And some people, like for me, they're like, okay, Woodstock, you had too much acid in the 1960s. And so that's why you have these crazy ideas. But it's, it's, a, it's a notion that goes back historically. So Freud had a guy, Otto Rank, that was one of his disciples for a while before he headed out on his own. And Ronk in the 19, I don't know, 40s or so, I think in a book called Truth and Reality, he said, look, human consciousness is remarkable because once you're conscious, I think the quote is, he says, that makes us the temporal representatives of the cosmic primal force. And at first I was like, wow, what are you talking about? Temporal representative of the primal cosmic force. And then he keeps going. He's like, okay, primal cosmic force. We're alive. And if you go back a couple of billion years, life started somewhere, someplace. All right. But think about it. of necessity, this is just common sense masquerading as philosophical insight, we are related. We are directly descended from the first thing that was ever alive. And that means that we're related somehow to everything, animate as well as inanimate, trees, everything. We are related to everything that's ever been alive, is now alive, or ever will be alive. And as you said it so eloquently a few minutes ago, well, that doesn't prove where we came from or where we're going, but it does suggest what we in our little group here at Skidmore are calling, it gives us a sense of cosmic connection. And that's not a death denying fiction, that's just an awareness of the reality of the cosmos. The atoms that we are composed of, they existed long before we did, and they'll continue to exist long after we're no longer about. And I don't know if maybe that is a delusion of sorts, but I find that very comforting that I'm part of a bouillabaisse of cosmic activity that has been in the works for billions of years. And it is not for any of us to judge the extent to which that we may have had a consequential effect on not only who we are, but the world around us. I know a lot of us are like, oh, I wish I was like Jesus, or I wish I was the fastest person in the world, or richer than Elon Musk, or cure cancer. But I like this guy, Henry Miller, who was a novelist of the last century. And he's like, I got to be honest, we're not going to be great, most of us. I'm not going to win a gold medal. I'm not going to be a professional athlete or fill in the blank. Yeah, but you don't know. Maybe someone like you, Ryan, you're just walking down the street one day and there's somebody on the sidewalk that you just look up, and you know how sometimes you meet somebody and you just have a little eyeball and that momentary nod, like, I know that we're here together. Well, you never
Mm,
see that person again, but how do you know they weren't going to walk to the nearest bridge to kill themselves? But your momentary acknowledgement of their existence changed their minds, and maybe that's going to be the next Buddha or the next Martin Luther King. And again, so for me, that makes us all equally potentially important. And none of us should be self deprecating and deny the possibility that we can have a profoundly important effect on the folks around us without the more traditional sense of what it means to be incredibly successful.
that's amazing. I love the way you said all of that. And I'd like to circle back to how you jokingly said that you took LSD in the 60s or whatever, because I've actually never heard you speak about psychedelics. And that was one of the things I wanted to ask you, because a common thread in the newer research in psychedelics, and even if you go back through time and look at the studies, and if you've had a subjective experience, that's the thread, is that it's got this interconnected element to it. And it's almost
Absolutely.
like most cultures had a die before you die practice. It was a very
Yes.
important piece of it. And I think that's what they're finding, is that if you're terminally ill, it's gotten like an 80 to 90% feedback loop on making people feel more comfortable with their own malaise, their own dying process. So
Yes.
I'd love to know if you've had psychedelic experiences, and if so, what are your perspectives on that?
Yeah, my perspectives are um, that these are really important, potentially invaluable ways of accomplishing or of attaining a sense of cosmic connection and the psychological well being that comes from that. And I noticed on your awesome website about Breathe for Flow that you're familiar with Stanislav Grof's work. And so I'm in college in the mid 1970s, and we are doing these things because it was part of the culture of the 60s. Unfortunately, I think that set us back 50 years because these drugs became seen as forms of entertainment rather than radical means of personal and social transformation. So Grof is writing in the 1950s in Eastern Europe about what he called psycholytic therapy. And these were like elephant doses of psychedelics that were given over time in a carefully controlled clinical setting. And according to Grof, there's an amazing progression where initially people are focused externally. You're like, wow, look at all the colors, look at the sound of the music. Then he says that as you keep going, the experiences become more introverted and deeply personal until you bump into what he calls a core experience that you may not be aware of or not. So you may think that the most important thing that happened to you when you were a kid is when you got, like, you won a spelling bee, let's say, and that made you feel proud. No, but it may have been when you got nauseous and vomited at your friend's birthday party when you were 5 and you didn't remember that. And what Groff claimed is that that the psychedelic experiences often bring us to these core experiences, both good and bad, that then inspires us to integrate them into our sense of ourselves and the world around us. And this fosters a process of existential maturation that turns out to be a good thing. Now, as you know, what happened is in the United States, when basically in the 70s and 80s, and it's a long story because it had nothing to do with pharmacological reality, but we stopped funding any studies of the possible merits of the use of marijuana or hallucinogens until recently. And so it was mainly the studies of the terminally ill folks that you have referred to who have no prior psychedelic experience, where a single experience with psilocybin or it could be ecstasy or whatever they call that these days, MDMA. And yeah, you really again nailed it when people describe their experiences, even for the first time. And this is across cultures and even across ages. So young adults not dying, but in post-traumatic situations, they report the same thing, a momentary sense of being in outside of the world of time, where there is this awesome awareness that the world is so much bigger than any of us and that we will ever be able to fathom, and yet that we are nonetheless ultimately securely situated in that universe by virtue of our connections. And it's like, wow, all right, so does that mean you should be running out and grabbing hallucinogens? And the answer is, well, maybe, because I think what we have to remind ourselves of, and this was again, people that are interested should check out your site because you talked about how there's different ways of getting to the same point. And I like the book The Natural Mind by a guy named Andrew Weil in the early 1970s. And he's like, yeah, drugs can produce these great effects. So can extended walking in nature. Near-death experiences produce the same effects, although I don't recommend nearly dying in order to have them. So do these practices of meditation and mindfulness. And there's now awesome work by neuroscientists demonstrating that all of these superficially different activities, psilocybin versus extended aerobic activity out in nature versus meditation versus mindfulness, they may appear to be quite different. And yet, it seems that the reason that we feel exponentially better in the aftermath of them is because the same neural pathways are being affected in a fashion that renders us more receptive to life by virtue of being more acceptant of death. And we don't want to be like Mary Poppins. This is not to suggest, as you know, as a responder that works with reality, this is not to suggest that fear is going to go away, that anxiety is going to go away, that suffering is going to be eliminated. In fact, quite the contrary. If anything, you're more apt to notice it in your immediate surroundings. What it does suggest, however, is that these kinds of practices give us the personal fortitude. I like how Albert Camus said it, come to terms with death. Thereafter, anything is possible. And what I like is that not only does this make us flourish, but at the same time, it dramatically enhances the character of our relationship with our fellow human beings. And I think at this moment in time, I can't think of anything more important right now. In our world, we're a petri dish of psychopathology, where too many people in the United States feel alienated, isolated, insignificant, and inconsequential. And I do think some of this is in the aftermath of the pandemic. Some of it is in the being surrounded right now by environmental, economic, and political instability. But this is really a timely historical moment for us to be attending to these kinds of very pervasive concerns.
Yeah, I agree. And it seems like it's obvious that the screen addiction and the exponential growth of technology and people being inside more and on screens more is having a huge effect on the dopamine levels and people's feedback loops of what their hedonic treadmill ends up becoming.
You
And
got
one of
it.
the best things right now to secure your own suffering and to take care of it is to unplug, get back in nature or connect with what is real. And
Yeah,
what is real, even if it's uncomfortable, it's better than the quick fix, which is the solution for most people, is to just quickly hit that dopamine, which is addiction,
that's
which is
right.
to treat the suffering. And so it's
Yeah.
a feedback loop.
No, you got it. And again, we're not trying. I don't think we're trying to be hypocritical because remember, at the outset of our
Sure.
conversation, we're like, I'd much rather us to be talking in the same room. Nevertheless, I am extraordinarily grateful for the technology that allows for these kinds of activities. Moreover, I tell my students, I'm like, hey, if you're having trouble sleeping, I'll show you one of our articles about our experiments, and you'll be napping after the first paragraph. If you really want to engage with these kinds of ideas, I suggest taking advantage of folks like you that are really right minded by trying to take these ideas and disseminate them broadly to the folks that might be most interested in them and might profit the most from them. Yes, so here we are, talking heads on the screen, telling people maybe to hear us out, but as I say it to the Skidmore students, yeah, then throw your phone in the toilet and let's go take a walk in the woods.
That's awesome. Yeah, I love it. It's a double-edged sword, and I use it. Believe me, I looked at my Spotify wrap up, and it said I had 300 hours this year of podcasting, and I'm like, well, that is incredible because I was listening to other people. Usually, my information stream is incredible people like you, and I'm learning while walking or doing laundry. But I'm
Yes,
also actually very lucky to be aware enough to go, you know what? But I also hike the mountain and I unplug and I spend lots of time doing all these things that counterbalance that because otherwise I would be a complete neurotic mess.
that's right. Yeah. No,
But
again, we should it be like I'm going to have to get a podcast so I can interview you about the breath work because I just think that breathing and moving and being outside are foundational, and that sometimes we tend to overthink things. The guy who trained me at the University of Kansas in the 1970s, now deceased, a clinician named David Holmes, people would come and they'd be like, "Oh, I'm so depressed, blah, 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 I need to talk to you." And he'd be like, "I'll talk to you next week. This week, I'd like you to go out and walk around for an hour." And this was
Mm.
long before these practices were viewed as potentially valuable. And I would ask him, I'd be like, "Well, why are you asking him to do that?" And I sent you one of our studies where we showed that slow, deep breathing reduces anxiety and physiological arousal in the wake of threat. And his point is, well, in order to walk, like it or not, whether you know it or not, first of all, you're taking deeper breaths. And then, moreover, in order to walk, like it or not, aware of it or not, you're activating the kinesthetic coordination between your body and your senses and your mind, rather than sitting still like a couch potato, where your breath becomes short and your attention becomes diminished. And he felt very strongly, and we now know this to be the case, that these are excellent precursors to subsequent psychodynamic conversation. This is not to suggest that walking around with a face full of fresh air is a substitute for therapeutic interventions. On the other hand, we shouldn't rule out the positive contribution that these activities might have. I have young therapists that were students of mine back in the day, and a lot of them, they offer in their practice, if their clients want, they do their hour walking and talking. And for some folks, they have a much easier time being disclosing things about themselves just when they're in motion and in kind of physical rhythmic synchronization with the people around them.
Yeah, I love that. I almost think like it should be a normal thing for
Absolutely.
psychotherapists to walk with their clients, even if it's just in a
Absolutely.
little, even if it's in a little space outside. But when we look at the foundation, if you're triaging what's the most effective way to be a human, it's all
Yes,
free, natural stuff. It's like get some sunshine every day,
that's right.
connect with the breath and the body, and move and sleep and drink some water. It's
Yeah,
like so simple, but you look at this is the culture I heard that has the most amount of therapy than all of human history. And
that's
we're the
right.
most depressed, we have the most anxiety, we have the most PTSD, all this stuff. And it's like, well, there's a reason for that. Maybe many reasons, but
That's right.
it's not always that therapy is the best thing. But it doesn't mean we should exclude it or think that it's bad either.
No, that's right.
But I think we're over therapy. We give it too much power sometimes.
I think that's a really good way to think about it. And again, to be silly, but by analogy, yeah, an overdose of anything is probably counterproductive. And
Yeah.
this, and not to go all academic-y, but we know that there is a danger when self-reflection, which is typically useful, becomes just a perseverating predilection. In other words, sure, sometimes we need to sit back and reflect. But I like how Rollo May, in a book called The Cry for Myth, an existential psychotherapist, he's like, hey, let's remember what the purpose of therapy is. It's like therapy's like if you're on a sports team and you're momentarily injured, so they bring you off and on the bench so that you can be attended to. But if all goes well, you got to go back out in the game. And Rollo May's like, well, the game for humans is our community. And
Mm.
if we become preoccupied with psychotherapy, there comes a point where it is at the expense of our relationship with those around us and the connection to the community to which we belong. And that's an unfortunate inversion of priorities. And again, knowing that for some folks, this may not be the case, but I like the Otto Rank people who say for most of us, therapy should not be permanent. It should
Mm,
be from time to time, for as long as we need to proverbially get back off the bench and back into the community. Now, of
I
course,
love
this,
that.
yeah, I love it too, Ryan. And again, this raises the question of how we're going to re enliven and re enchant our communities. I really don't want to sound like Father Time, except to say that back in the day before the phones, you were more likely when you were walking around to look up and just nod to people that you didn't know. And I can show you
Mm,
studies that's just called an informal social interaction, just a little nod of acknowledgement to a fellow human that you never see again is demonstrably psychologically uplifting. In the old days, almost every human did stuff outside of work in groups. You'd be like on a bowling team, or you would volunteer to do something, or whatever. You'd be doing yoga or something, but it wouldn't be by yourself with your phone app. And again, I'm not denigrating the youth of today so much as lamenting the world in which they reside. That partially because of the pandemic, that crushed us in ways that we do not adequately appreciate and severed our connection. Me too. I became like a DoorDash takeout food eater, and it's taken me years to remember why being in a public place is just extraordinarily more uplifting than an existence that really is ultimately quite isolated when we're enveloped in our screen bubble.
mm.
Yeah.
You brought up so many cool points that we could unpack because I think it's so important because we are so isolated now with the screens. I think the smartphone in 2009, 2010 was a paradigm shift for human consciousness that we'd
Yes.
never seen, where we had access to all of the world's information all at once and social media. So that's a huge, you could look at that as its own scientific experiment through all of time as like that
Yep.
might be the biggest paradigm shifter ever. And how did we get through that? It's almost like when we introduced processed foods and we had the
Yep.
obesity epidemic. And there's these big moments where you're like, this is a huge shift in consciousness.
Yeah.
But there was a part there where you were mentioning trauma and therapy, and I just wanted to unpack a little bit more because I've noticed that the incentivization structure that's developed around the therapeutic models is what's driving it in that direction a little bit too fast without being checked and balanced. Because even in the fire service and military, there's a lot more talk about trauma, which is a good subject. I liked The
Yes.
Body Keeps the Score, and I love the work that's being done with the body holding the nervous system, holding trauma. But I've also noticed that this generation is hyper focused on self examination to a degree that's almost so narcissistic. And it's like, at what point do you get back out in the field, in the game? Where is Viktor Frankl's narrative there? Where is the existential narrative there that's really important to touch on? Because, if I go see a therapist and I check boxes for trauma, the therapist gets the funding and they want me to keep returning. And then I get funding from the government, and I could go, you know what, I shouldn't have to see trauma as a first responder. And they can start building this somewhat of a victim narrative, and it's a belief system that changes the physiology of my body and my relationship to my experience, versus I'm lucky that I was on that call with that girl that drowned or that terrible horrific
Yeah.
thing, and I'm lucky that I have a nervous system that allows me to be stoic and balanced and serve. But I'm also grateful that I can now grieve and feel and weep, but get back out and keep doing it with a relationship to it as, how lucky am I?
Yeah.
Versus, I shouldn't have to, oh, poor me. And both of those directions are happening exponentially in the victim narrative. And I think it's dangerous. And I think there's a lot of funding behind it. And I think it's leading to a lot of people that don't even know it's happening to them, and they're being swept into that model too quickly. And I think, man, what about the centenarians and the people that survived the Great Depression and the Holocaust and World War II? And they found meaning like Viktor Frankl did in the Holocaust. And they created narratives that allowed them to be, you know what, I had Campbell's soup every day. They
Yeah.
weren't vegans and they weren't on the perfect diet. They were drinking coffee and whiskey and they were grateful. And I'm like, those are the people to study and to pay attention to. You know, human history is trauma, but it means that we're growing from that. And we can relate to that as thank you. I'm lucky to be alive and awake and aware. That gives me a burden of opportunity to serve. So, anyway, I wanted to unpack that because I don't like skipping over the
Yeah.
most important parts of the human condition, of course, which
Well,
is suffering.
no, you honestly, you summed it up beautifully. Um, and I don't know how to put it better, except to just repeat. You talked about a Frankel like conception of reality, which is based on the assumption that we're fundamentally collaborative, meaning making creatures. And that are at our best, we each benefit, from the delicate fabric of meaning that we essentially knit together. And at our best, we are grateful. I really do like how you put it. My folks grew up in the Depression, and they would talk about how awesome it was if there was lunch that day or an apple. All right, let's contrast that with the reality of today. And you said it when you described um, the world as somewhat narcissistic. Now, again, I don't mind being a little provocative here, and I hope anybody that's listening would feel free to disagree. This is about an exchange of ideas rather than a cavalier declaration that we're the all encompassing repositories of wisdom. But the fact of the matter is that we live in a malignantly narcissistic, almost sociopathic culture that I think, unless we understand the psychological damage that that is inflicting on the people in our culture, we're not going to get anywhere in terms of fostering improvement. And so there's a guy at Harvard, his name is Michael Sandel, and he wrote a book called The Tyranny of Merit. And the point that he makes is that 50 years ago, when I was young, it was okay to be average because, after all, the average person was average. It is average. And it's not that you don't want to be good at things, but there was a general awareness. If you played in Little League, everybody got to play a bit. It wasn't that everybody was equally good, and it wasn't that everybody got certificates or prizes. There was just a general sense that it is okay to be okay. All
Mhm.
right, now I teach at Skidmore. When I got a B in organic chemistry in the 1970s, I was so happy that we went and we got the goalpost down from the football field after having one too many beers, and we brought it into our dorm room, which didn't end well with security. But that was celebrating because we got a B. Today, if a student gets a B, they disembowel themselves in the parking lot. And that's because what our kids are taught is you have to be the very best at everything that you do or you're a failure. So if you're the second richest person in the world, you're a failure. If you're the second prettiest person in the world, you're a failure, and so on. And so here we are in a world where the youth are being taught to subscribe to a set of values that, if they apply them to themselves, or render them to be miserable, failing outcasts. And I think that that contributes to a chronic state of apprehension and disconnection with the folks around them. And so when the folks that I work with, and a lot of them do study how are we going to manage the psychological distress that is so pervasive right now. Over half of the people in the United States have one or two of the three symptoms of PTSD. So we're really a country of kind of zombies walking around in a disassociated stupor, and we and there is a lot of attention on the individual, but almost no regard yet for the broader cultural values that I believe need to be attended to, fortified by the associated cultural practices. In other words, are we designing our towns and cities to make people comfortable being in public and interacting? Are we creating a world where it's okay to simply be kind and decent? And even though this may sound naively optimistic, I think the more we can move in that direction, the less psychological anguish we will perceive. And I think that's going to help the youth kind of put down their phones and just feel more comfortable just in casual intersection with the folks around them.
Mm, I agree. I love all the points you just brought up. It makes me think about the Eurocentric model that it's built upon. And you were talking in another podcast, I think with Lex, about John Locke's work. And I'd love to get into
Absolutely.
some of that and hear what your perspectives are on Eastern philosophy, because a lot of the stuff that's therapeutic to read and to integrate into my consciousness over the last 15 years is stuff by like Thich Nhat Hanh, this little
Yeah.
Vietnamese monk, and reading books about Zen. Some of my favorite teachers are Zen practitioners, not saying that this is better. It's more just looking at it from a lens of like, there's different cultures. In Japan, it's the opposite of the individual is the priority, and not saying that's better. It's different. And so if we
Different.
look at like all the differences and you go, okay, I'm an individual inside of a weird electromagnetic soup and I'm going to be dead soon. And I can unprogram and program myself in certain ways. That's interesting. That's what I learned in the float tank when I was in the tank back in the day. It was like,
Nice.
oh my gosh, I'm like a little biocomputer. And you come through with all this old stuff.
Yeah.
And when you start to lay there long enough, you realize that you can't just trust yourself, because most of you is just a conditioned walking, talking, whatever your culture gave you. And so it
That's
takes some
right.
time to reflect and unpack. And then when you go to choose which packing in you want to put back into your nervous system and your consciousness, I found Eastern philosophy to be quite useful as one of the tools to grab from when I'm thinking about human beings, not human doings, and this idea of success or whatever it is that's been conditioned. And I don't think most people even know that there's a there there. They're just, it's
Nice.
happening. So there's this whole thing to unpack what you just talked about that comes from our conditioning, which goes back through all of time, which goes into like Jordan Peterson ranting about his models of the individual and, all this stuff. It's like, I agree with some of that, but a lot of it's just dogma and it's
Yeah.
programming, and it can lead to all kinds of problems. So I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on Locke's work and that whole Eurocentric model versus like an Eastern model.
Yeah. I mean, again, you said it. I think that in my classes we read John Locke seriously, and I think it is important to understand a lot of the things that we have benefited from by virtue of his ideas. Because anybody that kind of likes democracy or the idea that we have innate and natural rights as individuals, we should be grateful to Locke. Uh, Having said that, though, the way that he accomplished that was by advancing an argument that's one of the way that I blubber about it. It's one of the few unambiguously wrong claims about human nature in the history of social science. Because what Locke argues is that there's no such thing as societies in nature. there's only individual autonomous humans that are pursuing their own self-interest. And, and then what Locke says is, well, okay, but here's the problem. If we're just individuals pursuing our interests, that's he calls that in a state of nature. We're all free, and we all do what we need in order to survive. But his point was that that wouldn't work because basically, if there's an apple tree a mile away, and I go and I pick an apple and I'm eating it, and somebody's sitting next to me, it'd be better to just grab a rock and crack my head and take that apple rather than walk a mile. And that was Locke's point: is we would be in a perpetual state of war and chaos in a state of nature because people would be selfish and predatory. Moreover, they'd be retaliatory. So you take my apple, I crack your head, then your relatives see that and they crack the heads of my family. And we just escalate into decades of ongoing brutality. All right, so then Locke says is that, well, what we must have done at some point was to get together and form societies by voluntarily relinquishing our individual freedom in exchange for the security that a collective society provides. And in Locke's view, this is what conservative folks today embrace. Locke's view is that individual freedom is most important, and the role of government should be very limited. It's to keep external threats away. So you need an army to kill the people that want to kill you. And then basically you need an internal domestic police force to maintain tranquility. And then Locke goes on and he says, well, okay, what about private property? There's no private property in nature or in the Bible. And he's like, well, all right, but surely I own my body. That's my property. And surely if I work to get something, if I walk into the apple tree and pick an apple, well, the labor that I deploy to pick the apple, that transforms common property into my public property. And Locke was like, hey, the world is ginormous. And so if I put a fence around an apple tree, that's my apple tree. If you want some apples, you go find your tree. And then he's like, all right, well, England's full. So if you want some land, go to America. It's either empty or there's ignorant savages there, and you just push them aside. Anyway, the point that Locke made is that we have the right to accumulate as much property as we would like, and that moreover, people are different. Some of us are more adventurous and motivated than others, and therefore they're going to have more property than other people. So inequality is both natural and necessary, because his argument was that the people that have a lot and do a lot, that the rising tide lifts all boats and that we're all better off because of that. So anyway, to make a short story long, Locke's vision that, and most of the Western world subscribes to this vision, whether they're aware of it or not. They place the individual on top of the society in terms of what's most important, and they see the pursuit of our individual desires as natural, necessary, and to the benefit of everybody. Well, but the fact of the matter is that could not be more wrong. The last primate that was autonomous was the lemur, like 6 million years ago. There is no more social and dependent creature than the human being. And so when Margaret Thatcher said there's no such thing as societies, there are only individuals, well, she had it backwards. There's no such thing as individuals. There are societies that enable us to somehow grow up and perceive ourselves as individuals without realizing our extraordinarily hyper interdependence on each other. And here's where the Eastern notions come in. And by the way, it's not just Eastern. Plato, back in the day, saw the individual as necessarily subordinate to the society, and that the good life of the individual was dependent on that. But the Eastern view sees individuality as either an aberration to be obliterated through meditative techniques or a derivation of a communal life in which our identity is derived from our connections with other individuals. And then we don't need to get political or economic except to note that almost everything that Locke says about inequality being fine just happens to be wrong. He could not be more wrong. The reason the United States is on the cusp of our next Great Depression and in the process of going from democracy to fascism is because of radical inequality. So there's a guy named Peter Turchin who wrote a book called End Times. And this book was a couple of years ago, but over a decade ago, he said America's going to fall apart right around now. And it wasn't a political argument. He studies the dynamics of societies, and it was based on increasing inequality. And he's just like, look, inequality gets to a certain point, people get miserable, then they get angry. And when that happens, you get some kind of Hitler type that comes along and says, only I can fix it. But they have no interest in fixing anything. They're just going to collaborate with the fellow billionaires. Mussolini defined fascism as collusion between politicians and corporate interests in order to continue to immiserate the little people that they claim to be benefiting. All right, back to the point, though, about Eastern thought. I find the same things. The techniques that Western psychologists are now preoccupied with, mindfulness, yoga, not yoga like just down dog, remembering that yoga is about the interface of the body and the mind. So the meditation, the mindfulness, this sense of a connection to everyone and everything around us. Those are the things that I find soothe my existential apprehensions. And back to one thing, Ryan, and then back to you, and that's that John Dewey, who's an American philosopher about a century ago, he made an interesting point, which is that one of the eerie things about the improvement of technology is that it creates the erroneous impression that we are all increasingly autonomous. And that, and his point is that that's going to be a disaster because we're forgetting about the reason that we appear to be autonomous. It is because of our dependence on everyone else around us. Back to Plato. He's like, if you're alive today in Athens, it's not because of you. You didn't build the roads. You didn't create the army or make the schools or the civic government that produces stuff like water and mail that you take for granted. And but the Dewey point, so here we are in the 21st century with our phones, and even I sometimes are like, fuck, I'm like a mini god. If I want something, I'll yell into my phone and Amazon Prime will send a drone through my window in the next 10 minutes, or like DoorDash or whatever. But like what I tell the students in part to remind myself is every one of those things is the result of often thousands of years of human cooperation and collaboration that produce these technological advantages that they're rather amazing, but they do incline us to lose track of the fact that they're making us feel a whole lot more powerful and autonomous and independent than we actually are. And that's why I'm like back to the Buddhism, back to the in my classes now, we're reading a lot of indigenous American things. There's a book called Braiding Sweetgrass. I don't know if you've heard of that one, by a woman named Robin Kimmerer. And she's a Native American poet and writer, and also a PhD in biology. And it's making the same point that you did earlier, Ryan, which is that I'm not saying we should, get rid of our houses and our technology and go back in living in caves so much as to notice that we're not the only culture that has ever existed on the planet, and that many of them that were quite prosperous and stable for thousands of years, and you used the term earlier, they're cultures of gratitude. It's not to be a little profane like it is today, I'm the best and fuck the rest. It's not Elon Musk flying to the moon when America was in the middle of a pandemic and he pissed away more money on his rocket than it would have taken to vaccinate everybody on the planet. It is a shift towards the awareness that there are ways of deriving meaning that do not require inflating each of us to obscene proportions by detaching ourselves and berating those around us. And so, yeah, I'm not saying let's get rid of the West and become completely devoted to an Eastern perspective. Maybe this is just me being pragmatic and trying to have the best of both worlds. But why not? Why not, as you put it earlier, now having this revolutionary access to all that is in terms of information and possible connection to different ways that people have historically come to terms with life in the wake of the reality of death. Yeah, let's fish around. Let's not arrogantly declare ourselves to be exceptional. That's another point. Right now, I am back on one of my rantings, but Americans, for example, and there are polls that have showed that Americans, we have one of the worst healthcare systems in the world in terms of outcomes relative to how much money is spent, right? I still would rather be in America if I need a doctor than in Somalia. All right, but we can be doing a lot better. And yet, when the Americans are very hostile to looking at what other countries have done, and this would be a good time as Americans to be a little bit more grateful and humble. And rather than declaring ourselves to be the absolute best at everything, how about being willing to take a peek and borrow from the smorgasbord of life? There's a lot of folks out there that we can learn from, and frankly, in a dynamic and respectful engagement with other folks, perhaps we have values and practices that will be useful in exchange.
No, I love it. And it all seems to tie back to your whole life's work, which is the subject of death,
That's
and
right.
how all of these behaviors are being driven by the neurotic, subconscious awareness that you're going to die, which is why someone like Elon, as much as he's an incredible innovator and we can respect the fact
Absolutely.
that, yes, you can learn from that guy and go, wow, we can achieve so much, but should we? go forth with this exponential technological movement when we haven't taken account for what's going right already. That
There
whole
you go.
gratitude piece is really becoming an accountant for what's already happening, and a lot more being than doing. And it's just like we praised the wrong thing. So we've become somewhat of a hospice culture. We're in the death of a culture. We're seeing the
Absolutely.
demise of the planet. And like,
Yeah.
that, yeah, yoga is union of breath, body, mind, all that. But it's also realizing that you're a part of this environment, the soil you eat, the air
Yeah.
you breathe. And if you do one thing over here, it affects something over there. So we can't just keep plundering and acting like we're separate from the planet. Otherwise, we're not going to make it. So
Yeah.
it's not some virtue signaling. It's more like, geez, we're connected to this beautiful old thing called the earth. We're not separate from it. And it ain't going to make it. It's not going to sustain us being here. It'll go on forever, as
That's
George
right.
Carlin said, and we'll be shaken off like a bad case of the fleas.
That's right. No, there you go. And again, I like how you put it. So this is not in any way an across the board denunciation of folks like Elon Musk, who I think deserve remarkable credit for their accomplishments. On the other hand, not amongst them is the obscene arrogance of, oh, let's occupy Mars after we've reduced Earth to a smoldering heap, or let's spend a couple of $1 trillion and abandon our bodies and have our souls or selves put on some giant computer cloud. With all due disrespect, those are shameless efforts at radical death denial that are
Mm-hmm.
at the expense of the actual physical universe in which we reside. And this is not to suggest that, again, we abandon medical innovations so much as accepting the reality of the human condition as radically connected, embodied animals sharing a planet with other forms of life that will go on regardless of what happens to us. And that, yeah, and that we can do better. That's the other thing that I think is important, that is something to consider, and that is that this is not the first time that humans have almost had the ignominious distinction of exterminating ourselves. And I like how Nietzsche put it. I can't remember in what work, and it doesn't really matter. But he did point out that that in late 1800s, in the gay science, he has the famous saying, "God is dead." And you got to read the rest of the paragraph, as I keep telling folks, because his point was that, and you said it earlier, that we're in hospice. Our cultural worldview is in the process of being disassembled. There are not enough people in the world that share a common vision of it. And that's what Nietzsche said. He said, God is dead. Christianity has become unbelievable. He wasn't denouncing religion or Christianity per se. He was just saying that with the theory of evolution, the Industrial Revolution, that fewer people took seriously the Judeo Christian worldview. And he said it would take like 200 years for us to come up with another one, and that meanwhile things were going to be fairly turbulent. So I like Oswald Spengler wrote a book called The Decline of the West, based on Nietzsche, and he's like, yeah, when the cultural shit hits the fan, people don't know what to believe, and that's why they engage. And I don't mean this negatively, but that's where you get like cult like adherence to some people. But I'm not a Christian anymore. I'm about tofu or yoga, or and what Ronk said is that when we don't have a culture to turn to, we often make our bodies into forms of culture through things like piercings and tattoos. And he didn't, this is not a judgment. It's just a statement that we have no alternative. We still need to derive a sense of meaning and value, but we have nothing to turn to. So we have to turn to ourselves and transform ourselves into cultural artifacts. Right. But then Nietzsche keeps going, and he's like, yeah, you might not like to hear this, but it may be that the entire society has to be reduced to rubble, physically, economically, and psychologically. And while that may not be pleasant, and in fact, it may be fatal to a large chunk of humanity, it may be that out of the compost of the ruin of what was, that might be the fertile grounds for what might come thereafter. And
Mm.
again, it's like, well, you might want to dismiss that as like a children's story, but there's so much evidence from the Native Americans, from the Eastern cultures, that human history has been an ongoing cycle of the developments of cultures that are often stable for quite some time. But life happens, weather happens, war happens, geography happens when the continents separate over thousands or hundreds of thousands of years. And so, yeah, here we are at a turbulent time where I do think that there are perhaps historically unprecedented levels of dis-ease. Put the hyphen between dis and ease. But yeah, but I think as disturbing as that can be, that we should not lose track of the fact that here we are, still centered on the notion that at our best, we are extraordinary entities capable of tremendous accomplishment by virtue of our care of and compassion for those around us, not an isolated effort to be better than everybody.
I love it. Yeah, I like how you bring it back to that piece because that's the existential
Yeah,
important part that's like, all right, well, in a world that's becoming more and more nihilistic and we're seeing the transhumanist movement taking over, and that's a really fast, crazy movement where everybody thinks that science and technology are going to save us. Big tech companies think that, and it's really a strange time to be alive, but the fact that you're alive and the
yes,
fact that you are able to do this, talk to people from all over the
absolutely.
world, if you just start taking account for the fact that all of it's happening and taking and reflecting on that, I think that that's how you create meaning, like you said.
Yes,
That's where the piece is that needs to be focused on, because we can think about all the negative, of course, because you need to take account for what's going wrong as well. It's very
that's
easy
right.
to do, but we got to take account for what's going right, and the fact that your lungs are working, your heart is pumping, and the fact that we're here is
That's right.
enough. It's enough. Life itself is weird enough to be okay with,
Ooh,
and
I
I love
love
that
that.
part.
Yeah, and again, I don't want to be academic-y or eggheadish, but a guy named Herbert Simon won a Nobel Prize, I think, in the 1970s, and he was a computer scientist, and he had this term, satisficing. He's like, we're
Hmm.
always yearning for perfection, and he's like, that has nothing to do with reality. Isn't it a fact that in reality, good enough is often great? And I do. I
I
really,
love that.
I love that. That's I really. Again, it sounds a little corny, but I'm like preoccupied with this. If you woke up this morning and had slept in a bed and had breakfast, that's like amazing.
Yeah,
And I don't. I really. I think that it may sound like I'm talking out of two sides of my face, but I really do feel like if we can invigorate the more communal, social, meaning making, meaning yearning proclivities of ourselves. And I say this to remind me, I like this Krishnamurti guy. He's like,
I
everyone wants to
love him.
change the world, but nobody wants to change themselves. But it's
Yeah,
like, I think that kind of focusing our attention on those aspects of human experience, that will not only improve our psychological well-being, but I'm going to go out on a limb and I'm going to say that's going to improve our technological capacities. We see the Elon Musks and the Steve Jobs of the world, and it gives us an unfortunately erroneous impression about innovation because, yeah, there are some people that do great stuff. But cultural innovation, as a guy named Joseph Henrich, who's an anthropologist at Harvard, points out, he's like, no, innovation is really the dynamic interaction of clumps of people eagerly engaged in efforts to make stuff happen. And so even creativity, if Elon Musk grew up in some isolated village on the North Pole, he'd be functionally illiterate, just like most everybody else. And so I think we need to just not lose track of what would be best for everybody. Might also be best in terms of producing individuals that are going to make the world around us tangibly better at the same time.
Mm, I love it. And I love Krishnamurti as well. And I remember when I myself, 15 years ago, couldn't be alone with myself. I was
Me
always
too.
busy, right?
That,
And I forced myself into those float tanks, and I forced myself to build a relationship with stillness. And
yes.
one of the things I was realizing was if you can't be here now and you can't just be and not be doing, you're
Yeah.
never going to be happy no matter what you create or what you do. And I feel like there's a lot of praise and glorification and rewards built around momentum and progress, this idea of you're the success like Elon,
Yeah.
but we don't praise stillness and
That's
the
correct.
idleness. And I remember reading books to justify this philosophy in praise of idleness, books like
Yes.
that and books like Krishnamurti. And it was like these books, until I can feel content in this tank with myself, I'm not going to create anything.
That's
And
right.
I even asked myself the deep question. Alan Watts said, if you had unlimited resources
That's
and you had all the things, you're going to go and you're going to have the dancing girls and all the stuff, but then what? And it's
yes.
like, what would you do with unlimited resources? And I said, I don't know.
Me
And
neither.
until I know, I'm not going to get busy doing anything.
That's
And I
right.
think it's not to say this is the right way again, because there is no right way. That's the
That's right.
beautiful thing, is that there's no right way to live. There's just many different ways, and you get to subscribe to the ways. And I remember you mentioning Julian Jaynes' work,
Yep.
The Bicameral Mind, because that book blew my mind. And I
Me
could
too.
probably reread it 5 times, because if you scraped culture away and you got rid of everything and you start consciousness over from the beginning, it's interesting to imagine what it would look like and how it would reemerge. And it would be completely different every
There.
single time.
Yeah. No, no. That's one of my favorite books, and you obviously understand it because that is his point. We don't know.
We don't know. And that's beautiful, because then you're like, well, I can recreate myself and
There
I
you
get to
go.
create the meaning and I get to sort of choose the meaning I give to every experience I have. And that's important for people
Yeah.
as a
There you go.
therapeutic approach to life, is like you
Uh,
get to choose the meaning to every moment.
yeah, I love that. So I think it was Kierkegaard who said, he defined consciousness as the possibility of possibilities.
Oh,
And
I love it.
I love that. And at our best, that's awesome. And again, the counterpoint. So when I'm talking to the students, I'm like, wow, who wants to have the freedom to choose? And everyone's like, me, 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 me. And then I'm like, yeah, but who's been paralyzed by indecision when you're choking on choices? And then they're like, me, me, me. So there's the dilemma. On the one hand, we're the beneficiaries of, in many ways, the infinite possibilities. On the other hand, a lot of folks, especially the youth, are ironically choking on choices where, and this is in part, I would submit, because of this culture that demands excellence in everything that we do. Sometimes you make a choice that you don't like, but isn't that as important as making one that you do? And so, again, life can be described as an ongoing succession of choices, But I think we undervalue the value of mistakes and our right to reflect on past opportunities in the service of enhancing future directions. But yeah, it's that I think these are the things that would be important to emphasize to folks, that despite obvious concerns about our immediate circumstances, it is still for many of us, it's like, wow, I can't imagine a more exciting moment to be alive.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I agree. I think it is the most interesting and exciting time to be alive. If you zoom up at that high view and you're like, well, this is the weirdest, coolest time to be here for
there you
sure.
go. That's right.
But it doesn't mean that you don't see that we have more access to witness suffering on a scale that most people didn't have that feedback loop of. So it's weird to be killing it in your own life, but at the same time, you can't feel good all the time because you know there's suffering. Otherwise, you'd be psychopathic.
That's right.
So there's a whole weird double-edged sword to it because we are aware of so much existential debt and
That's
trauma and pain. While meanwhile, you can also hop on a jet plane and fly to the jungle and travel around on your smartphone and book things and talk to people. It's so cool, but at the same time, very painful. So we have to grieve as well.
that's right.
Yeah. I didn't even get into any of this, which is fine. This has been a fun conversation, but we haven't talked about your experiments and how you structured them. I'd love to maybe get into a little bit of your experiments around death and
Yeah,
how people
sure.
respond to it.
And we can talk again if this is useful, Ryan. But basically, Ernest Becker is very simple. He just says, look, the uniquely human awareness of death gives rise to potentially debilitating existential terror that we manage by embracing cultural worldviews that give us a sense that we're persons of value in a world of meaning. And that most of what we do as humans, even though we may not be aware of it, is to try and maintain faith in our beliefs and confidence in our value as humans. And 40 years ago, most people said, well, that's kind of speculative nonsense. Becker, that's interesting, but how could you prove that? How do you prove that our beliefs serve to deny death? And we developed a relatively simple paradigm that we call mortality salience. We're like, okay, let's remind people that they're going to die. And let's see how that influences their attitudes and behavior. And so sometimes we bring people into the lab and they fill out like questionnaires. And then right in the middle, we have a questionnaire. It's like, hey, write down your thoughts and feelings about your own death. And in a control condition, we're like, well, how would you feel if you were in a car accident and you had to have one of your legs cut off? Painful, but not fatal. All right. Other times we do experiments outside the lab where we stop people in front of a funeral parlor or like 100 meters to either side. And we're thinking, yo, if we're talking to you in front of a funeral parlor, then death's on your mind, even though you might not even know it. Right? And then another paradigm is we bring people into the lab and we have them read stuff on a computer. But while they're doing that, we flash the word death for like 28 milliseconds. So it's so fast that you don't even know that it's been
Mm.
blasted into your head. Right. And so then the question is, well, what happens thereafter? And so, for example, when we're reminded that we're going to die, we like our own tribe more and we hate and hurt people who are different. And so Christians reminded of death, they like Christians more and they hate Jewish people. Israelis reminded that they're going to die, they love Jewish people more and they hate Christians and Arabs. Germans reminded that they're going to die, they sit closer to people who look German and
Mm.
further away from people who look like Turkish immigrants. And so that's one line of research. And another line of work, we've shown that when death is on your mind, it has a radical effect on your political predilections. This is a long story, but Max Weber, a German sociologist, said that in times of historical upheaval, we become attracted to what he called charismatic leaders, seemingly larger than life individuals who often claim to be divinely infused to rid the world of evil. And so Hitler was elected in Germany when he said he was going to make Germany great again. And basically, the same thing has happened in our world today. All right, long story, but since the year 2004, when we showed that American support for President George W. Bush was dependent on whether or not death is on your mind, we have found the same thing for every election. And so in 2016, in our studies, Americans liked Hillary Clinton more than they liked Donald Trump, except if we reminded them of death. And then they liked Trump a whole lot more. So that's another aspect of our research, is that death reminders make us more prone to support what I would describe as ideological demagogues. Death reminders make us more resistant to the idea that humans are animals. They make us more hostile to nature and more eager to destroy nature if it's going to produce wealth. And then there's another line of work that shows that death reminders influence our economic aspirations. When we remind people they're going to die, they say they need more money to feel comfortable. They want high status objects like fancy cars and Rolex watches. If we ask them to draw a picture of money, they draw it bigger. Even having money in your hand, just to count it, you don't get to keep it, you just touch it, that reduces death anxiety. And then finally, people who are reminded of death, if you have any symptom of a psychological disorder, it is magnified by death reminders. So if you're afraid of spiders, you're more afraid of spiders. If you have obsessive compulsive disorder, you spend more time washing your hands and you use more soap. If you're socially anxious, you'll hide in a closet for a longer amount of time. So there's now several thousand studies showing that when death is on our minds, it alters everything from who we love and hate, how we dress, who we vote for, what we would like to buy, and even the manifestation of psychological symptoms associated with a variety of disorders. So there seems to be a substantial body of work that confirms Ernest Becker's central claim about the pervasive role of death in life.
It's amazing and interesting, but the one thing that keeps nagging at me as I hear it, and I've heard it when you speak before, is I've become curious more and more about social engineering and marketing. And you look at Edward Bernays' work, and you
Oh,
look
yeah.
at like the big pharma's role of advertising and making people believe things. It's almost like in Fight Club when he splices single frames of pornography into family films.
Yeah.
And no one knows they even saw it, but it programs in sex, right? And with you, you're talking about death and fear and all of these unfolding elements of psychology. Well, think about when Operation Paperclip happened and the
Yeah.
CIA hired all the Nazis and they took all of what they understood about manipulating consciousness with fear and everything they
Yeah.
learned from Nazi Germany. And then the CIA and MK Ultra developed with our best scientists ways to manipulate the masses. And you look at 9/11 or you look at
Yeah.
COVID or the war on drugs, and you think this is an incredible superpower that's being deployed in ways that we can't even wrap our head around through media, social media, newspapers back in the day, to get people to be in fear and more controllable and to get them to basically be little puppets.
Yeah.
So, what do you think about social engineering with all this data?
I think we're seeing it before our eyes.
Yeah.
And well, basically, and we may have to have another extended conversation about this, but basically, we're already marinating in intimations of mortality, but that's accelerated by, according to Hannah Arendt, the philosopher who was trying to understand the origin of fascism. Her point is what fascists do is to turn fear into rage. I don't want this to be a political discussion today, except to note that the next president of the United States was elected by fundamentally lying about everything in a persistent effort to keep his supporters fearful and enraged. And the fact of the matter is that the two issues that were responsible for his election was a misrepresentation of both the economy as well as the situation about immigrants. Now, again, I don't want to get into this is not a political discussion right now. This is just me claiming in response to your point, Ryan, that whether folks know it or not, the people who are influencers, political and social, and particularly the kind of Fox News of the world. There's a guy named Drew Weston. He's a professor at Emory University, and he wrote a book called The Political Brain, where he uses our work and he points out how the politicians are already very much aware of and are deploying these ideas to keep people permanently lobotomized and oblivious to reality. So yes, I do see this as having dangerous implications. At the same time, it doesn't mean that these same psychodynamics can't be parlayed into our advantage by bringing out the best in us rather than the worst. And that would be my hope for the future.
Yeah, and I know you got to get going, but I just wanted to bring up the weapons of mass distraction being the ultimate tool, just keeping us like the Circus Maximus of the day. Keep you distracted. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, psychopaths are running amok playing chess. But
no, and there
just
you go.
Starting to question the fabric of reality a little bit and knowing that, we're being hijacked a little bit by a lot of different directions, and there is a lot of sophistication behind it. So it doesn't mean you should be afraid. You should just be a little bit more humble and curious.
There you go.
But I just want to ask you before we go, because we have moments, I want to let you go because you said you had to, but what would you want to share with the world if you died today?
That it's going to be here tomorrow.
I love it. Hey, that's the truth.
No, thank you. I think that's
Cool. It's been really fun. I hope we can do a round two. I really enjoy
me too.
speaking
You
with
know how to find me, and this is great because I want to learn more about what you've been up to. And so next time around, let's talk about how you've been putting these ideas into practice, both in your work. And like I say, folks that are listening, I just stumbled today on the Breathe for Flow site that I found not only the site is pleasant to look at and eloquent in terms of the way you present the ideas, but they square with the research that just supports the contention that there's top-down and bottom-up ways to foster psychological well-being. We can have a cerebral discussion, and I hope we did, and then we can have a somatic one where the body becomes the basis of the foundation for subsequent well-being. Yeah.
I would love that. Yeah, I love Grof's work. I've read a lot of his work, and I do appreciate what you've said there and appreciate your time today.
Yeah, my pleasure, Ryan. Have a good one.
You too. Thank you for listening to the episode. Be sure to subscribe to the show on Spotify, YouTube, and iTunes, and rate the show. I hope you enjoyed the episode.
What we call reality is in fact nothing more than a culturally sanctioned and linguistically reinforced hallucination.